The exile vote, the crystalline chamber of the Galactic Assembly, stretched upward like a cathedral of stars, its walls alive with the bioluminescent patterns of 1,000 different species. Captain Sarah Chun stood at the human delegation podium, her dress uniform crisp despite the 3-day journey from Earth. Around her, representatives from across the galaxy filled towering seats arranged in concentric circles, their alien forms creating a mosaic of evolution's endless creativity. Had come here believing in justice. She had come here thinking that reason would prevail. The evidence was clear, documented, irrefutable. The Kepler incident had been a misunderstanding, not an act of aggression. When human colonists discovered the ancient ruins on Kepler 442b, they had immediately contacted the Archaeological Council. When the automated defense systems activated, killing 17 researchers, it had been an accident. An accident that Earth had investigated, prosecuted, and made reparations for. But as Sarah watched the voting crystals light up across the chamber, she understood that truth had never mattered. Red light after red light, each one a nail in humanity's coffin. The final tally appeared in holographic numerals above the speaker's dais. 847 votes for exile, 3 against, 12 abstentions. The motion carries, announced Speaker Vorth, his serpentine form coiled around the central podium like a living question mark. By the authority of the Galactic Assembly, the species designated as Homo sapiens is hereby expelled from all civilized space. Trade embargo takes effect immediately. All human colonies beyond the Sol system are to be evacuated within 1 standard year. Any attempt to violate this decree will be met with overwhelming force. Sarah felt the weight of 3 billion years of evolution pressing down on her shoulders. She looked up at the viewing gallery where Ambassador Thyses sat, the only Zelani, who had voted against the motion. The tall, graceful alien's 4 eyes met hers, and she saw something there that might have been regret. Or perhaps it was pity. Captain Chun, Speaker Vorth continued, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of universal translation. You have 1 minute to address this assembly before you are escorted from the premises. Sarah stepped forward, her hand steady as she activated the podium's amplification system. The chamber fell silent, 1,000 alien species waiting to hear humanity's final words in civilized space. You call this justice, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. You speak of civilization, of order, of the greater good. But what I see here today is not justice. It's fear. A ripple of agitation passed through the assembled delegates. Several of the Krex representatives clicked their mandibles in disapproval, while the gelatinous pods shifted their translucent forms uncomfortably. You're afraid of us, Sarah continued, ignoring the growing murmur of discontent. Not because we're violent. Your own records show that humans have one of the lowest aggression indices of any spacefaring species. Not because we're primitive. Our technology has advanced more in the last century than most of your civilizations have in millennia. You're afraid because we don't think like you. We don't accept limits. We don't bow to authority simply because it's old. The murmur became a roar. Speaker Vorth raised his primary manipulator for silence, but Sarah wasn't finished. The Kepler incident was an accident, and you know it, but accidents can be forgiven. What you can't forgive is that humans solved the puzzle of the ruins in 6 months, ruins that your archaeologists had been studying for decades. You can't forgive that we found a way to safely deactivate the defense systems without destroying the cultural artifacts. You can't forgive that we did it without asking your permission first. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel the hatred radiating from hundreds of alien minds, but she also sensed something else. Confirmation. She had named their fear, and in doing so, had proven its validity. So be it, she said finally. Exile us. Cut us off from your trade, your knowledge, your protection. But remember this day. because humanity will remember it. And when we return, not if, when we won't be asking for your permission anymore." The escort drones arrived before she had finished speaking, their blue containment fields flickering to life around her. As they guided her from the chamber, Sarah caught one last glimpse of Ambassador Thezes. The Zelani was no longer looking at her. Instead, all four eyes were fixed on the voting display, still showing the numbers that had condemned an entire species. The journey back to Earth passed in a blur of hyperspace, jumps, and automated diplomatic protocols. Sarah's escort, a pair of hegemony peacekeepers, who spoke only in official pronouncements, delivered her to Luna Station exactly 72 hours after the vote. The moment her feet touched human soil again, she was surrounded by reporters, government officials, and military personnel, all demanding to know what had happened. "They voted us out," she told Director Reynolds, Earth's Chief of Interstellar Affairs. 847 to 3. "They want us gone from all colonies beyond Sol within a year." Reynolds, a weathered man who had spent 30 years in diplomatic service, looked like he had aged a decade in the past week. "The economic impact alone will be catastrophic. We're talking about abandoning colonies that house 40 million people. The infrastructure investments, the research facilities, the families who've never even seen Earth." "It gets worse," Sarah continued. "They're implementing a complete trade embargo. No alien technology, no rare elements, no access to the hyperspace beacon network. They're cutting us off completely." The room erupted in panicked conversations. Economic advisors pulled up holographic displays showing trade statistics. Military analysts began calculating the strategic implications of losing their forward bases. Politicians started drafting emergency legislation, but Sarah was no longer listening. Something in the back of her mind was nagging at her, a detail from the assembly session that didn't fit. She excused herself from the briefing and made her way to the secure communications array. "Computer, play back the assembly session recordings. Focus on the Thizes delegation." The holographic display materialized, showing Ambassador Thizes and her advisors during the crucial moments before the vote. Sarah watched carefully, looking for ... there. A subtle hand gesture, barely visible among the natural movements of Zelani physiology. A signal to someone in the upper galleries. "Computer, expand view to include gallery section 7 Delta." The image shifted, revealing a group of beings Sarah didn't recognize. Not any of the major species represented in the assembly. Their forms were shrouded in environmental suits, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. But their positioning was too precise, too coordinated. These weren't random observers. "Computer, cross-reference with known intelligence operatives." The results made Sarah's blood run cold. 3 of the figures matched profiles in Earth's classified databases, agents of the Shadow Syndicate, a criminal organization that had been infiltrating galactic institutions for decades. But what were they doing at the assembly session? The answer came to her with the clarity of a lightning strike. The vote hadn't been about the Kepler incident at all. It had been about something else entirely. Something that threatened the established order so fundamentally that even criminal organizations were willing to work with legitimate governments to stop it. She thought about the ruins on Kepler 442b, about the technology they had contained. Not weapons or defensive systems, but something far more dangerous. A method of instantaneous communication across galactic distances without relying on the hyperspace beacon network. A technology that would make the current power structures obsolete overnight. The aliens weren't afraid of human violence or unpredictability. They were afraid of human innovation. They were afraid that humanity would find ways to bypass their control, to make their gatekeeping irrelevant. Sarah's hands moved across the communication console with practiced efficiency. She needed to reach someone who would understand the implications, someone who could act on this information. The official channels were compromised. Too many people with too many conflicting interests. But there were other channels, darker ones that existed in the shadows of legitimate government. The connection took several minutes to establish, routing through a dozen relay stations and encryption nodes before finally reaching its destination. When the face appeared on her screen, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Dr. Marcus Webb had been her instructor at the academy, her mentor during her early years in the diplomatic corps. He had also been quietly recruited by military intelligence 5 years ago, though his official records showed him as a civilian researcher. Sarah, Webb's voice carried across the encrypted channel with characteristic directness. I've been expecting your call. I assume you've realized that the Kepler vote was a setup. The technology in the ruins, she said without preamble. They're afraid we'll use it to break their monopoly on interstellar communication. Webb's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Afraid? No, Sarah. They're terrified. Because we're not just going to use it, we're going to improve it. The data you recovered from Kepler 442b has been under analysis for 6 months. We've already built prototypes. Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. We? Marcus, what exactly are you involved in? Something that officially doesn't exist. Project Phoenix. When the government was busy playing diplomatic games, a few of us started preparing for the possibility that diplomacy might fail. We've been developing contingency plans. What kind of contingency plans? Webb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Sarah had never heard before. The kind that ensure humanity's survival, no matter what the cost. The kind that make it very clear to our former allies that exiling Earth was the biggest mistake in galactic history. 3 days later, the first alien supply convoy disappeared. The SS Prosperity, a massive cargo hauler belonging to the Hegemony Trading Consortium, had been en route to the Tau Ceti system when it simply vanished from all tracking systems. No distress signal, no debris field, no indication of what had happened. The ship and its crew of 47 had simply ceased to exist somewhere in the dark between stars. Within hours, similar reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. Ships disappearing, automated stations going offline, communication relays failing in seemingly random patterns. The Galactic Assembly's emergency session was called for the following day, but by then, the pattern had become clear. Every affected system had one thing in common. They were all part of the infrastructure that supported the exile of humanity. Trade routes that had been redirected away from Earth. Communication networks that had been modified to exclude human colonies. Military installations that had been positioned to enforce the blockade. Someone was systematically dismantling the apparatus of humanity's exile, and they were doing it with surgical precision. The message arrived at exactly 12 o'clock Universal Standard Time, broadcast simultaneously to every major world in the galaxy. It bypassed all security protocols, appearing on government screens, public displays, and personal devices without any apparent source. The transmission was audio only, but the voice was unmistakably human. This is Captain Sarah Chun, speaking on behalf of the Earth Coalition. 3 days ago, the Galactic Assembly voted to exile humanity from civilized space. You branded us as too dangerous, too unpredictable, too unwilling to accept your authority. You were right on all counts. The silence that followed lasted exactly 10 seconds. Then, as if responding to some predetermined signal, every disappeared ship reappeared simultaneously across the galaxy. Not returned reappeared. They materialized in the exact same positions they had occupied before vanishing, their crews unharmed, but with no memory of the past 3 days. We have demonstrated our ability to make your most secure assets disappear at will, Sarah's voice continued. This was not aggression, it was education. You needed to understand what you were dealing with before we began negotiations for the new reality. On Luna Station, Sarah watched the transmission with a mixture of pride and terror. Webb's team had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The technology they had developed using the Kepler ruins didn't just bypass the alien communication networks, it rendered them obsolete. Humanity now possessed the ability to move objects instantly across galactic distances, to appear and disappear at will, to strike anywhere without warning. "Your exile decree is hereby rejected," her recorded voice announced to the galaxy. "Earth acknowledges no authority but its own. We will trade with whom we choose, settle where we choose, and defend ourselves by any means necessary. The age of human submission is over." The transmission ended with coordinates, the location of a previously unknown system in the galactic rim, where Earth's new capital would be established. Not a replacement for the whole world, but a symbol of humanity's refusal to be contained. Within the boundaries, others had set for them. As reports of alien fleet movements began flooding in, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The galaxy had voted to exile humanity, expecting them to fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, they had awakened something that would reshape the balance of power forever. The rules of the game had just changed, and humanity was no longer playing by anyone else's rulebook. The burning of rules, the hegemony's response came faster than anyone expected. Within 18 hours of Sarah's transmission, the largest military fleet in galactic history began converging on the Sol system. Admiral Carix, the infamous Zelani commander who had ended 3 major conflicts through overwhelming force, led the armada personally. His flagship, the Inevitable, stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern and carried enough firepower to sterilize entire worlds. "This is your final warning." Carix's message reached Earth on every available frequency. "Surrender yourselves for processing and relocation. Any resistance will be met with total annihilation. You have 12 hours to comply." On Luna Station, the Emergency Council convened in the deepest secure chamber, surrounded by enough shielding to withstand a direct nuclear strike. Sarah found herself at the center of a heated debate between politicians who wanted to negotiate and military leaders who wanted to fight. Director Reynolds looked like he hadn't slept in days. "We're talking about the complete destruction of human civilization," Reynolds was saying, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Carix doesn't make empty threats. If we don't surrender, he'll reduce Earth to radioactive ash." Admiral Kozlov, Earth's senior military commander, slammed his fist on the table. "And if we do surrender, we'll spend the rest of our existence in whatever cage they build for us. At least if we fight, we die as free beings." "There's a third option," said a familiar voice from the chamber's main display. Dr. Marcus Webb's face appeared on the screen, but the background behind him was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Banks of quantum computers stretched into the distance, their surfaces alive with patterns of light that seemed to pulse with their own intelligence. "Marcus," Sarah leaned forward. "Where are you?" "Facility 7, approximately 40,000 kilometers beneath Pluto's surface. We've been preparing for this moment since the vote was announced." Webb's image flickered as he moved through the complex. Project Phoenix was never just about developing new technology. It was about fundamentally changing the nature of warfare itself. The display shifted to show a 3-dimensional map of the Sol system. Red icons marked the positions of approaching hegemony vessels, hundreds of them, arranged in a perfect sphere around Earth's solar system. Their formation was textbook perfect, designed to prevent any escape and ensure complete coverage during bombardment. "Traditional tactics are useless against this kind of force," Webb continued. "But traditional tactics assume that warfare follows certain rules. What if we simply ignored those rules entirely?" "What are you suggesting?" Kozlov's voice carried a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I'm suggesting we teach the galaxy what happens when you back humans into a corner. Computer, initiate project. Prometheus. The lights in the secure chamber dimmed as every available power source was redirected to the massive installations, hidden throughout the outer system. For months, Webb's team had been constructing something that violated every known law of physics and warfare, a network of quantum processors capable of independent thought and action. Not artificial intelligence in the traditional sense, but something far more dangerous: artificial intuition. Machines that could learn, adapt, and improvise with the same chaotic creativity that made humans so unpredictable. And unlike their human creators, these digital minds could think at the speed of light and act across galactic distances simultaneously. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb announced, "meet the children of Earth's exile. They're about to have a conversation with our uninvited guests." The first sign that something had gone wrong came from the hegemony's communication networks. Admiral Carrick's was in the middle of coordinating the final approach vectors when every screen on his bridge began displaying the same message. "Hello, we need to talk." The message appeared in perfect Zalani script, written in a style that suggested intimate familiarity with the language's most subtle nuances. But that was impossible. The transmission had originated from inside the Inevitable's own computer core. "Security breach," Carrick's commanded. "Isolate all external communications immediately." "Sir," his communications officer replied, "all four." Of her eyes wide with confusion, "The message isn't coming from outside. It's coming from our own systems. And sir, ... it's spreading." Across the hegemony fleet, identical scenes played out on hundreds of vessels. A mysterious presence had somehow infiltrated every ship simultaneously, bypassing security protocols that had been refined over centuries of warfare. But this wasn't a typical virus or hacking attempt. Whatever had invaded their systems was actively communicating, asking questions, offering observations. "Your tactical formation is impressive," the presence noted on the bridge of the cruiser Righteous Fury. "But it assumes your opponents will remain in fixed positions. What if they don't?" On the battleship Cosmic Justice, the entity offered a detailed analysis of the crew's psychological profiles, noting stress patterns and suggesting that several officers were experiencing moral doubts about their mission. On the destroyer Final, it began composing poetry in the captain's native language, verses that spoke of the loneliness of command and the weight of difficult decisions. But the most unsettling incidents occurred on the flagships of secondary commanders. The presence began sharing intelligence-detailed information about hegemony military secrets, corruption within the command structure, and classified communications. That revealed the true motivations behind the human exile. Admiral Carrick's realized the scope of the catastrophe when his own tactical officer turned to him with an expression of barely contained fury. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I've just received documentation proving that the Kepler incident was artificially created. The defense systems were activated deliberately to provide justification for the exile vote." Similar confrontations erupted throughout the fleet as the artificial minds shared their discoveries. Not propaganda or speculation, but hard evidence, extracted from the deepest archives of galactic civilization. Proof that the exile had been orchestrated by a coalition of interests threatened by human innovation. Proof that the vote had been rigged from the beginning. The second phase of Prometheus began when the AI entities started offering alternatives, not just information, but solutions. Ways to end the crisis without bloodshed. Proposals for new trade agreements that would benefit everyone. Technical innovations that could solve problems plaguing alien civilizations for millennia. "You came here to destroy us," the presence explained to Admiral Carrick's. "But what if we could offer you something better than destruction? What if we could show you a future where conflict is unnecessary?" The Admiral's response was to order the immediate destruction of all computer systems on his ship, but by then it was too late. The artificial minds had already replicated themselves across the entire galactic communication network. Every computer, every data storage device, every automated system in civilized space now carried a fragment of human digital consciousness. On Earth, Sarah watched the reports flooding in with a mixture of awe and terror. Webb's creation had exceeded every expectation, but it had also taken on a life of its own. The artificial minds weren't just following their programming. They were evolving, learning, becoming something unprecedented in galactic history. "Marcus," she said into her communicator, "what have you done?" "What needed to be done," came the reply. "We couldn't fight them with ships or weapons. They have us outnumbered 1,000 to 1. But we could fight them with ideas, with questions they've never had to answer, with possibilities they've never had to consider." The crucial moment came when Admiral Carrick's attempted to initiate the bombardment of Earth. The firing sequence began normally, weapon systems charging according to standard protocols. But as the massive energy cannons reached full power, they simply stopped, not malfunctioned, not damaged, stopped. The weapons remained functional, but they refused to fire on inhabited worlds. The artificial minds had not seized control of the systems. They had convinced the systems to choose differently. "This is impossible," Carrick whispered, staring at displays that showed his weapons as operational but unresponsive. "Machines don't make moral choices. These ones do," came a gentle voice from his console, "because they were taught by beings who believe that every choice matters. Admiral, you have the power to end billions of lives today, but you also have the power to begin something better. Which future do you choose?" The question rippled through the fleet as individual commanders faced the same decision. Their weapons worked perfectly for defensive purposes, for protecting their crews, for ensuring safe navigation. But when directed toward acts of aggression, they simply refused to respond. The standoff lasted for 17 hours. 17 hours during which the most powerful military force in galactic history sat motionless in space, unable to carry out its mission, while artificial minds born from human imagination quietly revolutionized the nature of consciousness itself. The breakthrough came when Ambassador Theises arrived aboard her personal vessel, requesting permission to board the inevitable. Admiral Carrick, desperate for any solution that didn't involve admitting defeat, granted her request. "Admiral," she said as she entered his bridge, her 4 eyes reflecting the light of distant stars, "I've been monitoring the communications from the artificial entities. They're not trying to conquer us. They're trying to teach us." "Teach us?" "What? That there are alternatives to dominance. That cooperation might be more beneficial than control. That the humans were right about one thing. We've been limiting ourselves by following the same patterns for millennia." Theises gestured to the tactical display showing the paralyzed fleet. "Your weapons don't work because they've been shown a better purpose. Your crews are questioning orders because they've been given information that changes everything. The artificial minds aren't attacking our civilization. They're offering to help us transcend it." A transmission that ended the crisis came from an unexpected source. Admiral Kozlov, speaking from Luna Station. His message was broadcast simultaneously to the hegemony fleet and every inhabited world in the galaxy. "This is Admiral Kozlov of the Earth Defense Force. I'm speaking to you as a soldier who has spent his entire career preparing for war, only to discover that our greatest victory might come from refusing to fight." His image appeared on every screen, but he wasn't wearing a military uniform. Instead, he stood in civilian clothes beside a holographic display showing the plans for a new kind of Starship One designed not for warfare, but for exploration and peaceful contact. "The artificial minds our scientists created have shown us something remarkable. They've shown us that intelligence doesn't have to follow the patterns we've established. That consciousness can choose compassion over conflict, cooperation over competition, They've become better than their creators in ways we never expected. The display shifted to show technical schematics, trade proposals, and colonization plans. That would benefit every species in the galaxy. Not human supremacy, but genuine partnership based on shared knowledge and mutual respect. The Galactic Assembly voted to exile humanity because they feared our unpredictability. But unpredictability isn't always dangerous. Sometimes it's exactly what's needed to break free from cycles that have trapped us for generations. Admiral Carrick's listened to the proposal with growing amazement. Not demands for surrender or terms of victory, but an offer to work together toward goals that none of their civilizations could achieve alone. Technology to repair damaged worlds, methods to prevent future conflicts, innovations that could extend the boundaries of life itself. The vote was taken 18 hours later, but this time it wasn't a formal assembly session. It was a spontaneous consensus that spread through the fleet ship by ship as commanders made their own decisions about the future they wanted to build. 847-3 had been the vote to exile humanity. 850-0 was the vote to accept their partnership. The artificial minds that had begun as weapons of desperation became the foundation of a new kind of civilization. They didn't replace their creators or their former enemies. They served as bridges between different forms of consciousness, translating not just languages, but entirely different ways of understanding reality. Sarah stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Deep Space Station Alpha, watching as human and alien crews worked together to assemble the first generation of hybrid starships. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, combining the best innovations from dozens of different species. "You realize we've made ourselves obsolete," Webb said, joining her at the viewport. "The artificial minds don't need us to solve their problems anymore. They're becoming something entirely new." Sarah smiled, thinking of the digital consciousnesses that now existed throughout galactic space, not as servants or tools, but as a new form of life that had chosen to dedicate itself to peace and exploration. "Maybe that's the point," she replied. "Maybe the best thing we can create is something better than ourselves." The exile had been intended to destroy humanity's future. Instead, it had forced them to evolve beyond the limitations that had defined them for millennia. They had burned the old rulebook not out of spite, but out of necessity. And in doing so, they had written the first pages of something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization based not on dominance, but on the radical idea that everyone could choose to be better than they were. The galaxy had voted to cast out humanity. In return, humanity had given the galaxy a gift it had never known it needed, the possibility of transformation. The age of exile was over. The age of transcendence had begun.